Hello, this is Adam Stevenson. Today I'm going to be talking about a little demo I made that makes use of Azure Active Directory to verify users' identities such that we can kind of block users from using our website and authenticate any web requests that a user makes from our website to request maybe secret data that the public shouldn't be seeing. So today I'm going to be touching on essentially there's two major parts of the project. There's a single page application that heavily uses Angular.js. It's a single page application, and it's built using TypeScript because that's kind of what we're using at work right now. Um, and I started from a nice template from that, and so that was pretty easy to get up and running. On the other side, we're using a Visual Studio 2015 ASP.NET Web API project, and so there's kind of two parts to it in that as we serve the site, the single page application site, we need to essentially authenticate users on that side, but we also need to make sure that any requests to the web API utilize the credentials that are brought over when we initially log in on the site. And so I have a quick little picture here outlining why that's an issue. So for a single page application, when the user initially hits our site, we're essentially going to send over a bunch of JavaScript and views that represent the whole site. And so this means that there's no more client to server requests. Essentially, the user has all the bits on their computer. And so this becomes an issue in that, let's say a user fakes authentication on the client side, and then since they have all the bits, they can essentially make web API requests. So if that web API request was not secure, then they could potentially be viewing data that should be protected, and that's poor design. So we really want, just to reiterate, two parts. We want to log them in on the browser and then pass along those credentials for each web API request. And so, as I said, I've built something using Azure Active Directory. And for the client side, we're heavily using a library called ADAL.js, Azure Active Directory Library for JS. And this has a component that integrates well with Angular.js, such that essentially all the web requests that get sent from our client application get tacked on the credentials once they're sent. And that makes it a really nice experience for the developer because there's just some very, very bare bones initial configuration, and then your application should just work kind of automagically with a secure API. And then on the web API side, we're going to be using some middleware called Owen. And so what this does is this essentially listens for all incoming requests to the web API and kind of man in the middles that and applies some logic. And so we're using Owen along with a specific Owen package to that works with Active Directory to essentially authenticate any credentials that are passed along. And then once we've authenticated those, we'll remember that they're authenticated such that we don't need to continually making round trips to check whether that user is authenticated, because that can add a lot of lag onto the experience of every web request. So I'm going to just start up the web API right now, and I'm going to jump into a demo of what we have. And so we have right now a web API hosted on localhost 44300 using HTTPS, and there is an endpoint called a RESTful endpoint called API to do. And so if I hit this right now, I'll get a message that authorization has been denied for this request. And this makes sense because the user has not authenticated. There's no cookie stored saying that this is me, and I should be able to use this data. And so if we jump back to my command line here and just serve up our single page application, gulp serve is going to serve up a static website on HTTPS 3000. So I'll refresh this in a second here. So I refresh this, we see a simple page. We have some to-dos, and the to-dos are what we require the authentication to see. So right now I'm going to click the login button. What this has done is it has redirected me to loginmicrosoft.com. And I'm going to log in as adstep@microsoft.com. And I'm just going to quickly run through my credentials here. And I got to do the two-factor auth. So I'm on my phone right now. There we go. Should be happy now. So essentially, once it completed the authentication on the login.onmicrosoft.com, it returned back to this site, and in the URL, it passed an authentication token that says that Adam Stevenson just logged on, and here's a token you can use to identify as him using Azure Active Directory for some period of time. It expires after a period of time. So now if I go to the to-dos, what's happening is we're sending a web request to our API, and the web request is requesting all the to-dos that have been previously saved. And so I've previously created a hello world right now. So if I pop open the inspector here, and I look at the requests, you'll note that there are two to-do requests. And so the first one is essentially a GET request that asks for authentication options. And then the second one, you'll note, has different request headers. And essentially the second one actually passes along the authentication. And so now that I've authenticated to the web API, if I request the page, it loads a lot quicker. Because we're using HTTPS and I'm passing along the same credentials that it's already authenticated, it can just automatically know, as long as I'm within my expiration period, that I'm good to go. So right now I can add maybe other to-dos. I can edit them, and then I can delete them. In addition to this page, once a user has logged in, we can recognize that and allow them to navigate over to some user details. And so these are some details that represent me in that Azure Active Directory. Yeah, essentially. So now if I log out, it should end up redirecting me back to here. And if I navigate to the to-dos, it will enforce that I log in. And if I use an email that should not be recognized by the Azure Active Directory tenant, the tenant being Microsoft, which should recognize all Microsoft employees, it'll give me this not truly informative message that I had some trouble logging in. And so right now, just to reiterate, we're hosting the site using HTTPS. This means that whenever we're making requests between the client and the web API, all of that traffic is encrypted. So any credentials that are passed over the wire should be secured. Right now we're using an unsigned certificate, but once we get a signed certificate, we should be guarding ourselves against man-in-the-middle attacks, where a malicious entity kind of places themselves in between the client and the web API. So if I click on the to-dos, we're going to be forced to log in. So this is essentially a proof of concept that we can get secure login using our Microsoft credentials. So now I just wanted to quickly run through like how simple this is using the tools that I explained at the beginning of the video. So if I jump into Visual Studio Code, which is opened in my auth experiment SPA, so this is the client side stuff. If I go to source and I go to index.adal.ts, and so this is a configuration function with some of the authentication details of my client. So I went to the Microsoft tenant on Azure Active Directory, and I've created an application. From that, I've been given a client ID that recognizes my application as a legitimate application of the Microsoft tenant, and the tenant is described by Microsoft.onmicrosoft.com. The ADAL authentication service provider is the ADAL Angular is a service provider provided by the ADAL Angular library. It takes all this client information to uniquely identify your application, and an HTTP provider. At the top here, we're saying that any request that goes to localhost 44300, which is hard-coded as our web API right now, needs to be authenticated using Microsoft.oncom add step to do API. And so essentially, this is another application in our tenant which uniquely identifies our API. And so essentially, if we've logged in, we've got credentials that through our client side application, and then they should work for the API application as well, because they're both under the same tenant. And there's just some configuration to kind of delegate the permissions from one application to another within the same tenant. And I won't be going over that right now. And then to enable CORS, every time the HTTP provider, every time someone uses an HTTP service, we're going to delete the X requested with, and this is just to allow Angular to successfully do CORS requests. And then the HTTP provider is passed into the authentication service provider because it needs to essentially listen for all of the outgoing web requests. And so it will listen for outgoing web requests that hit this, and then apply some logic to pass the credentials that will work for that, is what I'm saying. So that's all the configuration, as long as you have uh, the correct node modules, the ADAL Angular node module that you need to do to uniquely or to get essentially login working. So if I go back to and I'll be deleting the application, so these credentials won't be working for anymore after this video. If I go back to the to-do now, this is the to-do page that we saw my to-do list, and so it has, of course, a service associated with it that knows how to talk to the web API. And you'll note that this is a fairly clean implementation in that all the HTTP gets just make calls against the API endpoint. There's no logic for adding in security stuff or anything like that. And just to reiterate, that's because the ADAL Angular library listens for outgoing requests and does that kind of automatically for you. And just for how easy it is to log in, log out, if we go to the home controller, so this is the wrapper for the entire page. It has a home controller. You'll notice that I pass in this ADAL authentication service. And so this is a service that has some nice functions on it that allow you to just like literally log in, log out. And so we've hooked up a button press to call these methods, and it does all the logic for redirecting you to Microsoft or login.onmicrosoft.com, and it also has all the logic for when it returns, and it has the credentials passed in the URL for stripping those out and redirecting you back to the appropriate page. And so that makes the experience of getting authentication on your client side extremely easy and painless to essentially get up and running. So then switching back to the API side of things now. Wrong thing. Switching back to the API side of things now, you'll note that I have this. Sorry about that. You'll note that I have a, of course, I got a startup Owen class, and so when the API gets spun up, we'll hit this, and it will configure the authentication of the app. And so this uses Microsoft Owen Security Active Directory, and essentially what we're doing here is saying that the app should use Windows Azure Active Directory bearer authentication token. Essentially, anyone who makes a request needs to have this authentication. The audience is going to be the Azure Active Directory identifier of our API, which is distinct from the client. And the tenant, of course, is going to be the Microsoft tenant. And so you can just define those in our web config. I won't really show them off. And that's all it takes to say that we need configuration. If I go over to the to-do controller, essentially at the top, all we need to do is say authorize, and so this makes sure that all the requests get passed through the Owen middleware for authentication. And then we also enable CORS because that's disabled by default. And this says essentially accept web requests for anyone, but of course make sure they're authorized. So the last little piece I want to show you is when a user Yeah, sure. So when a user posts a new to-do, so when they try to essentially add it, make sure I'm up and running this, and if I go back to the spa and I log in, it'll prompt me to authenticate. Two-factor auth again, putting it in on my phone. Okay, navigating to my to-dos, loading. It takes a while because we're using a new authentication token. Nice, it picked up the previous one. I'm going to add a new to-do. I'm going to add, and you'll remember I have the breakpoint set up in my post that should catch this. Okay, so if we look at the to-do object, I've passed along who I authenticated to, but this is insecure in the fact that someone could pass along a fake one of these. At the very least, we've authorized them, so there's some credentials that are being passed along, but legitimately in the object itself, I passed along a string that says I'm Adam Stevenson at Microsoft.com. But what Owen allows us to do is essentially look at the credentials of the user, and so there's the claims principal, which holds the current user of the web that made the web request, and so you can essentially look at a lot of information and essentially what's in the user page for information about that user, so we can successfully identify kind of who they are. And so this is how, when I save to-dos, I can save them to a specific user. So you could kind of craft your web API request to recognize who was requesting the data and maybe return some very specific data to that person. So if I open up the owner who made the request, this is some unique identifier of Adam Stevenson at Microsoft.com that can be used for that logic. So with that, I think I'm done my video here. I hope this was informative. I just want to reiterate how easy and painless this actually turned out to be. I thought it would be quite difficult. This ADAL Angular project created by someone here at Microsoft, I don't see his name off the top, is very useful and very powerful, and is just a really good tool. And thanks again for watching. Bye now.